So what does this course do? It's basically it's about inequality in its in at various scales, and we can talk about inequality of what and what matters, and inequality among who, among which population. And so I think one of the sort of distinctive things about this course is that, you know, we spend a lot of time, like 2 to 3 weeks, just reading political philosophers about exactly the boundaries about inequality of what kind of things and in what population, and whether or not, you know, your idea of it, of why you care about inequality matters. So if you in fact care about inequality between countries, if you in fact care about inequality within a country, if you in fact care about inequality across individuals as a function of their parents' income, as a function of their group membership, and just kind of dissecting why exactly you should think of inequality as a potential concern for policy, if in fact you do, and it's a conversation. The other thing this course does is it's a quant-ish class, in the sense that a lot of the policy toolkit around issues of inequality are quantitative, in that you have to be implicitly comfortable with making quantitative comparisons across people. And so a lot of this class is about exactly how we measure and how we construct measures of inequality from different data sets. And the class project generally involves rolling your own, in a way, statistics in a real way. And there's a lot of like data visualization. So just basically like giving you ideas for tools and visualizations that you can use to like present a fact compellingly. And then towards the end of the class, what we do is we turn into policy ideas. And importantly, I think, and possibly is because of like my research interest being largely in political economy, is that we can talk about policy interests, about policy ideas, but I sort of like push students to have at least some response to political concerns, because when you're up in front of a policymaker, or you're trying to come up with you're a staffer on a campaign or something like that, an important thing is sort of assembling the coalitions and the audiences around a given policy idea, and sort of like very concretely talking about who wins and who loses from a given idea, and how you would make the case compelling. Kind of the raw material of the class. So one of the things I'm involved in this big open source economics curriculum project called Core. So a lot of the materials from this first lecture in particular kind of draw from the core economics textbook, and I made this graph, and it took me a lot of time, so I show it every opportunity I can, and essentially what this is showing is the world distribution of income, where you can see countries on as you move up and down. Those are countries ordered by their average income per capita. But then as you move like back to front, you get the income of deciles of each 10% of the population within a country. So you can kind of see over here that, you know, so this is the US. These characters are characters from the reading, Mark and Stephanie and Yichen and Renfu in China. And you can see the top 10% in the US is quite rich. The country right above it is Norway, which is also pretty rich on average, but it has much lower inequality. And so once you go further down into the income distribution in the US, you'll get, say, somebody like Mark, who is, let's say he's an auto mechanic, and he's making less than, you know, his counterpart in Norway at the same position in the income distribution, even though Stephanie, who's in the richest group in the US, is making much more than sort of the richest group in Norway. And then you can look sort of around the rest of the world in the same graph. So you can sort of see the richest 10% in Brazil here, which has a standard of living sort of roughly comparable to maybe the 50th percentile in the US. And then you can go further down into China, for example, where even the top 10% in China is still below sort of even the bottom 10% in the US. And then the bottom 10% in China is still probably living something like the 30th percentile, say, in Indonesia or India. So you can kind of like get a sense of the whole within and between income distribution here, and see it across and within countries. So if you have a computer open, you're welcome to do this just while I talk. So if you go to this website, I realize it's hard over Zoom to like copy and paste it, but actually let me paste it into the chat. Never mind. So I'll leave this up for a minute, but what this is this is an interactive visual of this kind of same graph that lets you kind of look at how the world income distribution has changed in every year between 1980 and 2010, and basically see how like China's moved up the income distribution at the same time that Chinese income inequality, for example, has exploded. So why should we care about inequality? I mean, maybe there's a reasonable case to be made that we shouldn't care about inequality, that really what we should care about is just poverty and absolute levels of well-being. And to the extent that we have any inequality but we don't have any poverty, that's okay. And we can talk about that. But I want to also suggest that there's like reasons why inequality has spillovers onto other things that we might think of as a problem, like social conflict and political polarization and just like functioning politics. So here's a graph that's kind of showing how inequality is associated with employment in protective services. So just like what we call guard labor. So basically, the more unequal a country is, the more of its resources are getting spent kind of on protecting property rights and deterring crime, and so it's just kind of keeping a lid on the latent social conflict that inequality generates. Involves like actually wasting resources on kind of this kind of guard labor. And so that's like a real economic cost, for example, of inequality. That's like probably, if you could lower inequality, you could probably spend less on protective cameras and cops, and spend more on other things. Another reason you might worry about inequality across countries is for the same reason, and I just kind of really love this graph. This is a graph of every country pair that shares a border, and basically looking at the difference in the GDP of the richer country versus the poorer country across that border, and then plotting the probability of you having a wall. And so basically, where inequality between countries across a border is high, and by wall I mean generally like militarizing the border in a variety of ways, and essentially where inequality between countries that share a border is high, you again kind of see that there's like a lot of resources invested in sort of making sure that the poor can't come in. And so that's also kind of a real like inefficiency from an economics perspective about what are some of the costs of inequality. Where does inequality across countries come from? And one of the reasons we're so historical, I think, in thinking about the sources of global inequality is just that inequality across countries is super persistent. So basically, if you like order countries by their GDP per capita in 1870, whatever the unit of that political unit was in 1870, and you correlate it with GDP per capita, today, you basically get that it's pretty monotonic. I mean, there's variation. There's countries that have gotten rich, like Japan, Singapore, Israel. There's also countries that have gotten poor, like Argentina and Uruguay. But by and large, basically the countries that had managed to take part in the Industrial Revolution by, say, the end of the 19th century are the rich countries. And then everybody else has been like trying to catch up and has succeeded with and there's variation in the degree of success. So that's like a long-term perspective. A much more recent perspective is just kind of what has changed in the global income distribution over the last 20 years. And this is from Branko Milanovic's book. And this is between 1988 and 2008. So I'll update it in a minute. But, and this is sort of kind of like what was famously called an elephant graph. And this is like the world income distribution, just like the whole population. And so what you can kind of see is that where economic growth has happened, it has happened in these middle income countries. So think China, India, Indonesia. These are all these like very middle income class, if you want to call it like the global middle class. That's kind of happened here. But then you kind of have the rich around the world, like the top 1 to 5% have also done really, really well. While who's like kind of not done super well are the say working classes in the rich countries, say around here, which is globally, it's like say the upper middle class. And so they have not done super well. But at the same time, you still have a bunch of countries that have been left behind. So like poor countries that have stayed poor and have not sort of experienced a lot of this global growth. So what does this look like when you go to 2018 and you kind of measure things a little bit better? You get like a much steeper growth at the top, and this is like what actually happens when you. There's a whole thing in the class where we talk about this, but like the role of tax havens in measuring global inequality. So once you account for the amount of money sitting in tax havens, for example, you actually get that like this elephant curve like stretches out a lot, so that the growth in income of like the global middle class, we were basically this earlier graph misses what's in tax havens. This graph accounts for what's in tax havens, among other things. And then you get that there's so much more money at the top that's sitting in tax havens that you can kind of like, what dominates this now is less like the hump in the middle and more the sort of takeoff at the top. And that's an important thing that will come up repeatedly, is that if you're really working like inequality at the top, the amount of money at the top that's held abroad is so large that without taking that into account, you kind of really miss a big chunk of inequality. And just in response to the question in the Q&A, so there's a little bit, I think the evidence on the actual violence is like weak and not particularly great. I think it's like the perceptions of violence. We should also think of the violence as like an equilibrium outcome. So the violence comes both as a combination of the incentives to do violence, which can be then reduced by increasing the amount that you expend on security guards, et cetera, so that the actual observed level of violence is low. And that's a product of like there being an increased demand as well for increased incentives for violent crime potentially, but as well as like increased incentives to like higher deterrence for violent crime, and so the net effect could be a zero. Importantly, across countries, there's a lot of variation. And so this is what puts like some meat on the bones that it can't all be technology and trade that's doing all the work here and explaining inequality. So what you see is that you have like these countries that are, what's on the y-axis is GDP growth. What's on the x-axis is inequality. And what you kind of see is that like, there's not a lot of variation in growth across countries. Like there's maybe, most growth across countries hovers around 2%. You can have a few countries that are a bit lower, but broadly it hovers around 2%. But there's way larger variation in inequality. So the U.S. has a lot, just like a lot of inequality, but it's not a particularly fast-growing country within advanced country. And so within the advanced countries, there's like, you could be Germany or Sweden with like low inequality and a decent rate of growth, or you could be the US with like high inequality and also a decent rate of growth. Now, counter argument to that is the rate of growth in all of these countries is kind of set by the innovation that's mostly happening in the US. And so the US in some ways is like bearing, provides all of these like high-powered incentives and like is a really unequal country. And that it's bearing the cross of advanced world innovation. And so like, a lot of the patents happen in the US, a lot of science and technology happens in the US. And so that you can't just kind of compare these countries so easily, because these countries, on the left are in some sense free riding on the innovation that's done by the US in particular. And then across developing countries, you have also this kind of variation where, people have often said that inequality is sort of necessary for growth, if you will, at least for developing countries. But, we have a lot of variation in this, and it doesn't look like, at least as like casual empiricism, that there's a lot here. So you have these these East Asian experiences like Taiwan and Korea that had insanely high rates of growth in the last part of the 20th century, in the last half of the 20th century, basically making it to the frontier and sort of like growing at the similar rates now as as a lot of rich countries. And then you have this Latin American experience that's like and importantly, those East Asian countries didn't experience a big appreciation in inequality. This is also, I suspect, one reason why they were able to handle COVID so much better than a lot of other countries, is like the same institutions that let them develop and with little increase in social conflict is also kind of gives them an edge in kind of running all the institutions you need to like handle a pandemic. And then you have all of these Latin American countries, for example, that have really high inequality and not a lot to show for it in the way of economic growth. Which kind of inequality affects a country most, do you believe? I don't know that it's the level of inequality across countries is kind of just how rich is a country overall, and so that matters for a country. Obviously, it's just the level of economic development, but a separate thing and a related thing is also kind of the within country inequality, which is just how dispersed, if you will, around that average level of growth well-being is. So, for example, Brazil will have, it's a moderately rich country. It has, but it is quite unequal. And both of those things matter for Brazil's overall level of development. For example. Okay, so far I've talked about just inequality of income, but I want to point out that inequality of income might not be the most obvious form of inequality you might be interested in. For example, like a lot of economists would say that we don't care about inequality in income, really. We care about inequality in consumption, like what people are actually spending. And maybe you want to take account of the fact that people are like smoothing their consumption over their whole life cycle. So you might you might save a lot when you're young in order to live really well when you're old. And so maybe you want to think about inequality in consumption over a lifetime. Maybe you want to think about inequality in wealth, and just kind of like the stock of assets that you have. Maybe that's the relevant thing for either political reasons or other normative reasons. Maybe we want to just think about inequality in happiness. So in your literal mental state of well-being, how happy are you and how dispersed is that? Maybe we do want to think about income. Income is a broad measure of purchasing power writ large, and what you choose to do with it is up to you. So if you're measuring inequality in income, great. We also might want to think about inequality in economic opportunities rather than outcomes. so if you want to think about, I mean, it's so cliched, but but like, oh, we don't care about equality of outcomes, we care about equality of opportunities. And so what does that mean? One interpretation of that is that you upweight the well-being of people that are born to poor families. And so if you really care about economic opportunities, you don't necessarily care about redistributing income based on what people are earning now. You care about redistributing income based on where the background conditions that people are from. And particularly when it comes to thinking about political institutions, you might want to think about inequality in the distribution of political and legal rights, and who's allowed to vote, whose vote counts, whose civil liberties are formally protected, who has actually the effective capacity to defend their civil rights. And then you can kind of collapse all of these into broad philosophical notions of freedom and unpack those into like freedom as choice, freedom as autonomy. And so one of the things, the readings, if you were doing them, would be for next class would be kind of a set of philosophical reasonings around inequality of what. But there's also, thinking about how just the nuts and bolts about measuring inequality over time. And so I'm not going to get into it here, but one of the things we talk about is like, how do you construct price indices? And how do you construct price indices to measure income, to make income comparable across countries? So what basket of goods do you pick to compare the income of someone living in Ethiopia to someone living in India or somebody living in Mexico? And how is that bundle of goods decided? And the real like substantive decisions that go into deciding on that price index, and how do you, and that is like kind of not necessarily an obviously neutral decision. And similar issues apply to measuring GDP over time. So how do you make a dollar in 2020 comparable to a dollar in 1980, comparable to a dollar in 1900, when the set of economic opportunities, the things you can buy, the level of technology, and everything is so radically different? What are the assumptions that go into that? And so here are some links that sort of are historical measures of GDP per capita. What I want to do for the next little bit is just quickly show you 3 ways of measuring. I'll probably skip distributions. I'll just do social tables and Lorenz curves and Genie coefficient. So the great thing about social tables is that they're old. So the social tables were like the first measurement of inequality, and they were done by like this guy like Gregory King in 1688. Basically came up with a measure of measured inequality in England. And what he was doing, and we do this today, if you wanted to think of like the temporal lords as like the 1%, or 0.01%, or 0.1% of 17th century England, you could then count what fraction of the population is that, what's their average income per capita, and what's their income per capita in terms of the average income per capita. And you can go from temporal lords all the way down to vagrants and paupers and miners and workers. And you'll see there's a lot more of these people, and they're a lot poorer. So 17th century England is a pretty unequal place. But we can actually turn this into, and I'll show you in a bit, we're going to convert the social table into a Genie coefficient. But just to give you some historical background, this is like kind of the traditional way that inequality was kind of looked at before we had statistics. Was just you'd take a list of the social groups, you'd figure out how many people there were in each social group, and you'd figure out what their average income was. You can do this even using fiction. So like you can construct a social table for all the people in like a Bronte novel, sort of getting a sense of their incomes as they're reported in a Bronte novel, and can come up with a measure of inequality as seen through the lights of Wuthering Heights. Let's see. And so this is the same social table for India at the eve of independence. And so this is like the British officials, for example, so however unequal 18th century England was, colonial India was way more unequal. And part of that was the British, that the British colonists were only like 0.06 of the population and had 84 times the average income. But a lot of it is just that India is super unequal, even without the British. So if you thought of like the nobility, the various Rajas and Indian capitalists, they had like 10 times the average income. And so, one of the great things about these social tables is that you can kind of compare them across a whole bunch of different societies historically and kind of make fragmentary pieces of data talk to each other. And so you can kind of put all of these societies on kind of the same scale. And in particular, you can compute like these 1% shares of income. So think Byzantium in 1000, the 1% of Byzantium in 1000 has 30% of the income. Compare that to Mexico in 2000, which is like the top 1% has 11% of the income. And what we can also do, though, besides looking at these top 1% shares from these social tables, is that we can also convert things into what are called Genie coefficients. And Genie coefficients are kind of the baseline measure of inequality, and it's something every CEPA student, in my opinion, should know how to calculate is a Genie coefficient. So normally what I do is I'll give you a handout with some formulas for how to calculate the Genie coefficient and some statistical commands in Stata and R for exactly how you would take like a data set and calculate the Genie coefficient. But let me just, for this purposes, give one example of the Genie coefficient. So think about this. This is like West Bengal, let's say, or rural Mexico. You have, let's say, the main asset we're interested in here is land. And so rural Mexico on the eve of the Mexican Revolution, if you will. And what happens is that you get, there's 10 landowners, they own everything, all the land, and then you have 90 farmers that own nothing. What the Lorenz curve does is it plots, ordered by the share ordered by income, the share of whatever it is, land or income, that's owned by the bottom, then the middle, then the top. When you only have two groups, it's just the bottom and the top. So 90% of the population has nothing, and that's this line here. And then 10% of the population, these 10 landowners, own everything. And so that gets you up here, and so that accounts for 100% of what's owned, and it's split up between these two groups, A and B. And so if you were taking one of these social tables, you would have many more of these edges. You'd have something that bowed out a lot more, like this, but this is just like a two-group social table. And you can calculate the Gini coefficient from this. It's just the share of, it's just the area of this triangle in red as a share of all the area below this 45-degree line, A plus B. So the closer this triangle gets towards the corner, the more and more the rich own. And so in the limit, right, the Gini coefficient is 1. That's like the maximum amount of inequality a society can have, is when the rich own everything, like where one person has everything and nobody else has anything. The maximum amount of equality you can have is 0. And that's when this Lorenz curve is equal to this 45-degree line. And so then you get like a Gini coefficient of 0, because there's no area in between the red line and the gray line. And so the Gini coefficient in this example is 0.9, super unequal society, pretty close to 1. So that's inequality in land. Let's imagine we go to inequality in income in West Bengal or rural Mexico, and so that's going to be a lot less. So let's imagine that these are all sharecroppers, right? So the sharecroppers get 50% of the income from their land, and so you have 90% of the farmers are getting 50% of the income. So they own no land, but they're keeping 50% of whatever they produce. And so they have 50% of the income, and then the landowners get the other 50%. So that's like a sharecropping system where shares are 50-50, super common around the world. And here what you get is that the Gini coefficient for income is like 0.4 instead of 0.9. And that's, again, this difference in the difference between this blue Lorenz curve and this 45-degree line. Okay, let's talk about, again, inequality. Let's now look at world inequality through the lens of the Gini coefficient. So this is like inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. When you look at across country inequality, inequality has been falling. Convergence, countries like India and China have been catching up. Not clear that any economic inequality is necessary for convergence. The South Korea and Taiwan examples I gave earlier are countries that converged fine without any increase in inequality. But in countries like India and China, the really big countries that have been growing moderately quickly, I mean, China's been growing insanely quickly. We've seen an enormous increase in inequality in China. And one really super interesting thing is that a lot of these families that are experiencing this increase in inequality in China are like third-generation children of the landlords of China, like before the Chinese Communist Revolution. So it's interesting new research that's kind of like formed these links of families and showing that a lot of these families that are like getting super rich in China today are in fact like the grandkids of landlords circa 1920. So that's interesting. So yes, so inequality across countries has been falling as these big countries like China have like gotten richer, but the within country inequality has increased at the sort of the same time. And so that global inequality has been sort of roughly constant on the whole when you think of like the world Gini. So we can also use the same kind of Lorenz curve idea to get a sense of like what things like technology and automation will do to inequality. So imagine now we have workers. We have workers that are, we have the unemployed here. So this is like 10% unemployment. And then we have 90 to 10. Those are like workers. And then we have like the top 10%, let's call them capitalists. And then let's think about what does the effect of like robots or technological change going to be on inequality. So what do we think is going to happen? Well, one of the fears is that technology is going to increase unemployment because robots are going to take the jobs. And so what that would do is push the share of the unemployed to from 10% to 20%, let's suppose. And because the unemployed are not getting any income, that's going to result in the share of income going to workers plus unemployed falling to like 42%. And so the Gini coefficient is going to increase. So in this example, it goes from like 0.36 to 0.56. So you can get a sense of like from the Lorenz curve, because if you imagine that technological change increases unemployment, that's going to come along with an increase in inequality. And so you can see that by looking at the effects on the Lorenz curve and on the Gini coefficient. I'll skip this. So the last measurement thing I want to talk about is the limitations of the Gini. The problem with the Gini coefficient is that you need lots of data. So you need like these social tables to be broken out into lots and lots of groups, or you need like a household survey that sort of covers the whole population. And so a lot of those things aren't available for a lot of countries in a lot of time periods. Another criticism that, for example, Thomas Piketty makes is that the Gini coefficient obscures differences between the bottom versus the middle versus the top, and that those are different moments of the distribution are differentially revealing of different things. And so what Piketty and co-authors do is they look at like 1% share. So this is the share of income received by the top 1% over the 20th, over like 100 years. And you can kind of see that like this is this U shape that's been seen in both like English speaking rich countries as well as a bunch of developing countries. So like India and China have also kind of seen this, well, we're not quite sure about China, but we think it's probably true, have also kind of seen this U shape in inequality over the 20th century. But this hasn't happened again everywhere. So if you look at a lot of European countries, you kind of see that the 1% shares haven't increased nearly as much in these European countries as they have in these other countries, sort of suggesting that, again, it can't, like, even though these European countries are also experiencing trade with China and robots, if anything, like Germany has more robots than the US, yet we're, you don't really see like this kind of takeoff of like top end inequality there. I will skip this. But this is the kind of, but I will talk about this. So this is the top 1% share in these countries now accounting for tax havens. And so this comes back to what I said earlier. And what I want to draw your eye to here is Russia. And just like the stark U shape in the 1% share in Russia, where obviously the Russian Revolution did reduce inequality. I think that would be surprising if it didn't, and reduced it to like a really low level. And so inequality during the Soviet Union was very, very low. But then with the end of the Soviet Union, inequality jumps so that it's like higher than, it approaches US levels in the space of like a decade. And you wouldn't see this if you were just looking at Russian income data. Where you can really see this data is all the assets and money that was moved to Cyprus and London. And once you account for, again, the tax havens, this is the asset stripping that happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the rich just kind of moved all their money abroad. And once you account for that money that's sort of stashed abroad, you kind of get that Russian inequality went up enormously with the end of the Soviet Union. So it's like kind of world-class inequality. Okay, so that's it on income inequality. Let me skip this stuff and jump to one thing talking about racial inequality, and I'll end on that. Well, actually, let me do one other thing first. Let me talk about equality of opportunity. So the way that we measure inequality of opportunity is looking at these things that are like what's your probability of making it to a given percentile, given what percentile your parents were in. So if you think of like, oh, you were born in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, like your father made 20% of was in the 20th percentile of the earnings distribution. What was your probability of staying in that poorest 20% versus making it to the richest 20%? So if you look at the US, if you're born in the poorest 20%, you only have like a 7% chance of making it to the top 20%. Well, if you're born in the richest 20% in the US, you have basically a 10% chance of falling into the poorest 20% and a 36% chance of staying in the top 20%. But if you then go look at a country like Denmark, if you're born in the poorest 20%, you only have like a 25% chance of staying there and a 16% chance of making it to the top 20%. And when you look at the richest 20%, you have a 16% chance of staying there. You have a 33% chance of staying there, but a 16% chance of falling to the bottom. So Denmark is a much more mobile society and offers that was really mobile. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Yes, I'll come back to that. I'll post that link once I'm done. So mobility in the U.S., despite the U.S. kind of having this idea that it's like a really, everyone can make the American dream, it's a super mobile society, et cetera, et cetera. It's not actually very mobile at all. And importantly, it's a lot of that difference in mobility is just because of racial inequality, which brings me to what I want to end on. So what this is you can think of this as like what percentile your parents are in from 1 to 100. So if your parents are in the top 1%, they're right here. They're right here. If your parents are in the bottom 20%, they're right here. And this is as a child when you're like 30, what percentile are you at? And this graph is separately for white and black households. So if you look at like white households, it's actually reasonably mobile. It's the probability of what's the average rank of kids born at the 20th percentile if you're white? It's like it's the 40th percentile. That's a fair amount of mobility. But what's the average rank if you're born at the 20th percentile and you're black? It's 25. And so the level of absolute mobility between white and black, holding background income constant, is a lot lower for black households than it is for black kids than it is for white kids for the same income level. So it's like white parents are just way better at turning their money into advantages for their kids than black families. And this is particularly true for like white men, get a particularly high return from their parents being rich. And so a lot of the US exceptionalism in like how immobile it is driven by racial differences. And I want to point out that this hasn't always been the case. This is like data from my own research, just looking at that same sort of thing across the 20th century. And when you look at it, there is this brief window between 1940 and 1970 where black mobility really caught up to white mobility, and you can see it because like the white mobility, the green line, which is like white mobility in those cohorts, falls, so that whites were doing, for a given level of parents' income, whites were doing worse than they were before, and that's coming because like blacks are doing better on intergenerational mobility for the same income level. But that hasn't really, that has been reversed basically since the 1970s, and there's so many mechanisms. So if you wanted to look at college attendance rates, incarceration rates, high school completion rates, all of these things are lower for poorer households, but even holding like the income of poor households, even within poor households, there's still like this steady racial gap. And it's particular, and what's interesting about this graph is that it's really there for men and not women. So the racial gap for women once you control for parents' income is extremely small, but the racial gap for men once you control for parents' income is very large. And that's just interesting, and I think one of the big sources of policy conversations, like what's going on there, and what can be done around schools, around family structure, around vocational training to make that reduce that difference. And so I just want to like give one graph that kind of illustrates the intractability of racial inequality in the U.S. is this. I just find this super depressing. So this is like the high school. This is high school friendship networks from North Carolina, and it just kind of is like the just showing how segregated friendships already are in high school. So it's like the two clusters are gender, like boys and girls, and then so it's just like in order to make a kind of real dent in racial inequality, you kind of need to handle not just these differences in economic inequality, which are there, but you also need to handle these other mechanisms like segregation and social networks and private associations, you need to handle discrimination, you need to handle political representation. And so what this suggests is like an upshot of the policy conversation is that you kind of need to do what's called a big push, that moving only one of these margins at one time will likely not be enough, because the other margins will come back and like basically reproduce racial inequality again at despite your best efforts to fix just one of these margins. And I feel like the history of racial inequality and caste inequality in India, which is something I talk about in the same lecture, it's really hard to just make progress with one policy tool. So I'll conclude there and give you guys a few minutes to ask some questions. So what this class does is we try to get into all these issues and give you tools, so talk about them both at a high level of philosophical and policy levels, but also try to give you like real like analytical tools to measure and analyze inequality in this class. So I'll leave it at that. And what kinds of policy, what types of decisions does income inequality help inform? I mean, even without putting any particularly like interesting spin on it, just like taxes. Like how much money you can raise from what kind of taxes is an immediate, like even if you didn't care about inequality, you would want to know something about inequality just so you could figure out how to set taxes across different parts of the income distribution, knowing how much revenue you could raise. And so just as like an input into tax policy, you would want to know the income distribution. In fact, Professor Kopsuk teaches a complementary class on inequality, which is much more focused on like tax issues and things like that. And the other stuff is like a whole variety of other policies, everything from like the minimum wage to unions to antitrust. You can imagine that if you have policymakers that just directly care about inequality, they might want to know what are the policy instruments that help reduce it. And I think there's like, particularly on the racial inequality front, there's no shortage of interest among policymakers, among activists for policy ideas that could make a real dent in racial inequality. And I think understanding the complexity of it gives you kind of a library of tools that will get away from like you just saying something silly like better schools or something like that without kind of addressing all of these things at the same time. Do pandemics reduce inequality in the long run? Difficult to say. I don't know that we have a lot of them. So for example, like obviously the Black Death reduced inequality a lot. I mean, wages went up like, it's an interesting point though. Wages didn't go up immediately after the Black Death. They took about 30 years and a peasants' rebellion for the population decrease. But that was like because 30% of the population died. So I don't know that, so yes, it's that pandemic, for example, definitely reduced inequality. The 1918 pandemic had no effect on anything really. No one really, before COVID, people didn't even really have any like historical memory of the 1918 pandemic. It was just like gone, even though it also killed a ton of people particularly in India, and particularly, so I think a history that should be looked at, and I don't know that much about it, is how much the 1918 pandemic like weakened colonial rule in lots of developing countries, for example. And that might be another way in which like pandemics kind of reduced political inequality more than economic inequality.
Professor
Anything
Naidu,
else? Yep.
It seems like there's a few more questions that are coming through the Q&A instead of the chat.
Got it. I think I answered a lot of these. Is that wealth or income? I think that was in reference to a particular slide and I don't know which slide that is referring to. Oh, wait, nope, got it. What would you think is the most important factor for social mobility? Great question. Depends on social mobility of what? So for example, in Denmark, social mobility of education is pretty similar to the US. So like kids of people with PhDs are more likely to get PhDs. Kids of people that go to college, and that's actually it's still different, but it's much closer between Denmark and the US. But the extent to which that translates into income mobility is really different. you know, Denmark compresses, you know, has high taxes, has a lot of, has high minimum wages, has strong unions that do a lot of work in compressing income inequality. And so if you want to reduce educational mobility, if you want to increase educational mobility, educational expansion is just like the thing to do it. So public schools, all of that. But it's not necessarily the thing that you care about if you care about reducing income mobility. And for that, you might need all these other, like what we call like pre-distribution or compressing institutions like taxes, unions, et cetera, if you really want to increase income mobility separately from educational mobility. Thank you for the, what, is it an issue to be in a class like this without quantitative experience? Well, I sort of encourage students to take this class after they've taken Quant 1 at least, because like the idea is that like this class should be something that you have taken the tools from your kind of benchmark SEPA classes, your required SEPA classes, and you really get to take those tools and use them in attacking some interesting issues. And so the class is kind of best, I recommend it for people that have taken, that are like in their second year, for example, or that are coming into their first year with a better, you know, quant preparation, because the class works best if you know at least a little bit about how to open up a data set and crunch some numbers with it. Do I think printing money is a reasonable solution to income inequality? Not really, not on its own. What role does the financial and banking system have in income inequality in the US? It's a symptom of really high income inequality. Is like you get a hypertrophied financial and banking system because you have a lot of money stashed at the top and they're looking for things to invest in, and that generates a very, very large financial sector. That's income, earnings, in fact, like labor income. Is there a silver bullet to solving inequality? No. I mean, war. And I don't even know about that. It's like there's really one period in which the US has really made a giant dent in reducing inequality, and that's between 1935 and 1947. And I'm sort of like, a lot of things happened in that period. I think a big part of it is unions, and just like getting union density from like 0 to 30% in 10 years will make a big dent. But you have to recognize that that's happening in a context where the whole economy is getting reformatted to basically beat the Nazis, and so it's like difficult to isolate exactly. You know, there's a GI Bill, and then there's tons of things that happen. But there's really only this like 15-year period that the US reduces inequality, and then it stays flat until it starts increasing in the 70s. And lots of things change in that 15-year period, and sort of an academic debate about which ones are most important.
All right, I think that is our last question for the day.